Martin, welcome. I'll introduce you quickly and then it's off to you. So Martin Pratt leads Border Map Consulting, an internationally respected expert in boundary making, border management, and territorial dispute resolution. Prior to establishing Border Map, Martin served as director of research at Durham University's renowned International Boundaries Research Unit, IBRU. Martin specializes in geographical and technical aspects of boundary making, but his expertise combines geography, international law, history, geopolitics, and cartography. He's worked with more than 40 governments and international organizations involved in boundary negotiations and third-party dispute resolution before the International Court of Justice, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and international arbitral tribunals. He's also advised numerous oil and gas companies, pipeline layers, shipping companies, law firms, and publishers. Over the last 2 decades, Martin has trained more than 1,800 students from 140 countries in practical aspects of boundary making and dispute resolution. And he continues to lead IBRU's professional training workshop program, and Border Map Consultancy offers a range of training services to governments, NGOs, and commercial organizations. There's a kind of a long intro. Sorry for my stumbling, but there we go. So welcome, Martin.
Thank you very much, Leah, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. It's a great pleasure to be participating in the summer schools again. This is my second year of involvement, and I think that the session I'm leading today went down fairly well last year, so fingers crossed it will be of interest to you today. I will perhaps offer a broader, more global perspective on boundaries and borders than some of the other tutors on this course. But I hope that what I have to say will be stimulating and that our practical exercise later today will be of some relevance to your work. I'm afraid I don't know very much about you individually, but hopefully over the course of the next few hours, I'll get a little bit of a sense of your interests, your experience, and I'm very happy to be interrupted with questions as we go along. I have a framework for the first part of the session, but if it's not meeting your interests, or if is something I say that prompts an immediate question, I'm very happy to be interrupted, and hopefully Leah can help with that. But otherwise, I will spend the next hour or so with some thoughts on boundary making and border management, particularly in the context of disputed or uncertain boundaries, which is the area I often find myself working in. I'd like to begin with some general thoughts on the role of international boundaries in the modern world. And I'm going to go back to one of the most famous lines in border studies, widely quoted in many papers written over the last 50 years or so. It was from a university lecture by Lord Curzon of Kedleston, who had been the British Viceroy of India at the end of the 19th century and would go on to be the British Foreign Secretary following the First World War. He was involved in many of the negotiations in the imperial phase of European boundary making at the end of the 19th century. And he gave a lecture to students at the University of Oxford, reflecting on his experience of boundaries, or what at the time he referred to as frontiers. And he described them, perhaps the single most famous line in this very long lecture: "Frontiers are indeed the razor's edge on which hang suspended the modern issues of war or peace, of life or death to nations." It's stirring stuff. A lot of the rest of the lecture also has this kind of rather pompous imperial language, but Curzon was reflecting on the fact that in the early stages of European boundary making around the world, defining international boundaries, control over territory, really was central to the very idea and existence of states, and reflecting the fact that at the time states were essentially still allowed to conquer territory and grab as much as they could, resulting, of course, in serious international conflict leading up through the First World War and the Second World War. And I think Curzon's notion that boundaries were inextricably linked to the identity and survival of states was true throughout much of the first half of the 20th century, and arguably through the Cold War period as well. But just as I began working in the field of international boundaries, a very different perspective began to dominate the discourse around international studies, especially relating to business and trade, but also in relation to border studies as well. And in another university lecture, this time given by former US President Bill Clinton, he told students at Harvard University that you live in an age of interdependence. Borders don't count for much or stop much, good or bad, anymore. And put very simply, at the turn of this century, the argument went that the forces of globalization were creating new relationships, identities, and patterns of movement that were rendering international boundaries meaningless, or at least largely redundant. And in Europe, at least, or certainly for the 26 states which have fully implemented the series of agreements relating to the harmonization of border controls, commonly known as the Schengen agreements, boundaries and borders are now invisible to most people most of the time. It is possible to drive from southern Portugal all the way to the north of Finland without having to show up your passport on many occasions. There is a vision of minimizing the impact of borders on everyday life. And certainly in much of Western Europe, and to lesser degrees in other regional blocks around the world, that vision for most people, most of the time, has become a reality. And some images from a rather lovely book by a photographer who went around looking at borders within what is sometimes described as Schengen land, gives a sense of a very peaceful and a landscape in which borders barely impact on your perception. But of course, freedom of movement within Schengen land is only possible by maintaining tough border controls at its outer frontiers, giving rise to the concept of Fortress Europe. And pressures over the movement of refugees, economic migrants, have at times strained that system close to breaking point. And during the COVID pandemic, for example, it became very evident very quickly that borders hadn't completely disappeared, and a lot of frontier controls were thrown up again very, very quickly. So that's not to say that borders have evaporated, but certainly in some parts of the world, the notion of the borderless world, to some degree, I think, has reached a degree of maturity, at least. But equally, while globalization has clearly reduced the impact of boundaries on the movement of capital and ideas, and to at least some extent on the movement of people and goods around the world, territory remains one of, and perhaps the key building block of political power and legitimacy, and states still go to great lengths to secure and defend their territory. Control over territory remains important for countering external threats to a state, whether that be in the form of illegal immigration, cross-border crime, and also for maximizing access to resources. And with the still growing global population, there is an ever-increasing demand for resources, especially water, oil and gas, strategic minerals, some of which are finite and in great demand. And it's hardly surprising that states still go to great lengths to secure and maintain control over the territory which is used to define the existence of a state. And I would argue that whether or not you fall into the borderless or the non-borderless world school of thought, clearly defined boundaries and well-managed borders do remain vital for national security reasons, good relations between neighboring states, for the efficient use of resources, which often straddle international boundaries, for effective environmental management. If states don't know the precise limits of territorial control, it becomes really hard to manage resources and other environmental elements which straddle international boundaries. For the more mundane aspects of international relations, managing cross-border trade, maximizing the efficient taxation regimes of states, for example, and especially important, I think, and hopefully this will come out as we move through this session, I think borders, clearly defined, well-managed borders, are vital for the prosperity of the borderland regions, which are often in the most marginal parts of states, a long way from the centers of power and economic prosperity. I've thrown out quite a few terms already. I've referred to boundaries, borders, frontiers, borderlands. I'd like to step back for a moment and just lay out what I'm referring to when I use these terms, and perhaps discuss whether there is any important distinctions between them. So let's begin with the word boundary. When I refer to an international boundary, I am generally referring to a legal and technical construct. It is the agreed line which separates the territory of two states. Technically, it is a line of no thickness, and it is the line that has to be negotiated, agreed, mapped, and perhaps marked on the ground. And I'll come back to the process of defining an international boundary in a few moments. But for me, a boundary has a very precise meaning, and I distinguish it from a border because I think a border, although a lot of people on a day-to-day basis use the term border when they're referring to what I've just described as a boundary, I think there is a concept of a border which is useful to distinguish between them. And for me, when I refer to a border, I am generally thinking of what you have to pass through to enter a neighboring state. Now, that might be crossing the international boundary that has been defined by two states. And in some cases, that is all that the border is. The border is the boundary. There's no other presence of the states at the boundary, and crossing the boundary is also passing the border. But typically, a border is more of a zone than a line. A border is likely to include the infrastructure of border crossings, which can take many forms. You can see a couple of very contrasting examples on the screen. Sometimes border infrastructure is very broad. It involves tens of thousands of border crossings a day, customs posts on either side of the line, often not located exactly on the boundary, but often set back a few hundred meters, maybe even a kilometer or two from the boundary. Borders may include fencing or other forms of barriers to prevent people from crossing, which again may or may not be located precisely on the boundary. The border can also include ports of entry, which are tens, hundreds of kilometers from the international boundary of the state. If you fly into my home country of the United Kingdom, the first thing you'll see at most airports is a big sign just saying UK border. And although the UK does have one land boundary, clearly these entry points are not boundary entry points, but airports, seaports, they're all part of the borders of states. I have no objection to casually using the word border to replace boundary. I think I do it, and without even thinking about it sometimes. And the distinction doesn't fundamentally matter. I just find it useful to distinguish between this concept of a line and a zone or series of zones, which is about the crossing and entry and exit from between two states. Lord Curzon, 100 years ago, used the word frontier when he was really describing boundaries and possibly borders as well. More typically in English, certainly, the word frontier today is used primarily in a historical context, classically typified by the expansion of European settlement through North America, the western frontier of occupation and even geographical understanding. But in other languages, for example, French, Spanish, frontière, frontera, that word is commonly used even today to refer to boundaries or borders. It's relatively rare to hear it in the context of interstate relations today, but it's still around, and sometimes you see it in older writings about what I would now describe as international boundaries. Very familiar image on screen now, a world political map. I think this one was produced by the government of the United States, but it's just there to represent what is a familiar image, and an image that perhaps is so familiar that it lulls us into a false sense of security. Counting international boundaries is always slightly risky because there are different definitions of what is a state, and different perspectives, particularly in terms of occupied territories and states which claim sovereignty to various degrees, and whether they should be counted or not. But in terms of membership of the United Nations, the world political map contains 323 international land boundaries with a combined length of in excess of 250,000 kilometers around the world. And at the small scale of a world map, the international system of states looks so neat and orderly. All the pieces of the puzzle seem to fit neatly together with no gaps, no uncertainty at all. The reality, of course, is that this map is the product of constant geopolitical change and upheaval over at least 3 centuries. Some political scientists argue that the modern state system began in Western Europe with the Treaty of Westphalia in the 18th century. History probably doesn't really matter to us today, but the key point is that this map is not stable, it is not finished. In some parts of the world, geopolitical change and upheaval is still going on today. Some of you may be experiencing territorial uncertainty in your own countries. To try and put some sense of scale on the degree of political change, political scientists Gary Gertz and Paul Diehl developed a data set in which from the early 19th century through to 1980, they counted 770 changes in terms of sovereignty over a particular piece of territory. So territory being transferred in some shape or form from one political power to another. 770 over a period of less than 200 years. What we can all get our heads around is that we've seen the emergence of 31 new states on the world political map just since 1990, so just the last 35 years or so. The majority of those, of course, from the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, but other states emerging as well. Eritrea, Timor-Leste, South Sudan. We might see the emergence of a new state in Bougainville in the South Pacific in the coming few years. The founder of the International Boundaries Research Unit, where I worked for many years, Professor Gerald Blake, counted 158 territorial disputes between states in the post-Second World War period up to the end of the 1990s, scattered all around the world. Another figure I'm very confident with is that since 1980, we have seen 39 either international boundary or territorial sovereignty disputes submitted to third-party adjudication. In other words, disagreements so significant that the parties could find no means of agreeing or settling their differences and asking the International Court of Justice or the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea or some other form of adjudicatory body to settle the dispute, assigning sovereignty to disputed territory, or perhaps interpreting the alignment of the international boundary between those states. So nearly one dispute a year, serious enough to submit to third-party adjudication. And then there's maritime boundaries. The map I showed you previously, like most world political maps, really gave no indication of maritime jurisdiction. It's not something I'm going to dwell on in this particular session, but maritime boundaries is a significant focus of international relations today. And the process of defining maritime boundaries around the world is very much an ongoing process. In simple terms, I would suggest that nearly half of the world's maritime boundaries have yet to be formally agreed between neighboring states. And around 30% of the world's ocean space now falls under the jurisdiction of coastal states in one form or another. That's significantly more than the land territory of the world in terms of area. And there are about 425 potential maritime boundaries. So we've still got around 200 or so which have yet to be formally settled. And some of those cause significant disputes between neighboring states. One example, which I'm sure most people have at least a passing familiarity with, the range of territorial disputes relating to the South China Sea. It's one of probably, if I was to make a league table of most serious disputes around the world, the South China Sea would be high up on that table, along with the dispute that I've illustrated with a cartoon on the left, although given events over the last 9 months or so between Israel and Palestine, it's not always easy to joke about the long-standing and very complex series of disputes between Israel and the Palestinian people. These are just examples of significant territorial disputes which have regional and even global implications. Fortunately, the vast majority of boundary and territorial disputes are not quite this serious, where there is an ongoing threat of regional instability. But there are a significant number of what I would call boundary-related disputes around the world. I hesitate to give a precise number because one person's dispute is perhaps what one state considers a dispute, another state will deny that there's any dispute at all. And the range of disagreements in terms of scope is so significant that it's difficult to say that everything falls into the category of a dispute. But there are still, I would say, 15 or 20 significant interstate disputes over territorial sovereignty, be it large areas such as Jammu and Kashmir, disputed between India, Pakistan, and China, through to small island disputes where the islands themselves are almost completely insignificant, but perhaps the maritime space around them is very important from an economic or strategic perspective. There are a large number of positional disputes, and I will come on to the reason for that in a few moments. But this is a situation where two states agree that a boundary has been established, but they don't agree on the precise alignment of where the boundary runs. So there is, in a sense, a territorial dispute there, but instead of a fundamental disagreement over legal title to a particular area, the states are disagreeing over how to interpret the alignment of a boundary that was previously agreed. And then there's a wide range of functional and resource-related disputes. These can be things like disagreements that have been provoked by one state unilaterally closing a border crossing for security purposes, disagreements over access to traditional grazing lands or fisheries, often for indigenous people whose communities have been separated by imperial or colonial boundary making in the past, where there may have been special arrangements that allowed for traditional grazing rights to be maintained across those international boundaries. Could be disputes relating to the use of boundary rivers or international rivers which straddle international boundaries, and I'll come on to the importance of those during the course of this talk as well. Similarly, disagreements over how to share transboundary resources such as oil and gas, minerals, or groundwater. A wide range of disputes relating to how states operate across international boundaries, and this brings us into the realm of border management, which is what I'm going to get to hopefully by the end of this session. If you want to get a flavor of the range of international disputes around the world, a quick place to look is the rather frighteningly named CIA World Fact Book, published by the government of the United States every year. I recommend this not because I'm a big fan of the Central Intelligence Agency, but because the people who contribute to the international boundaries section of that fact book are the international boundary specialists at the United States Department of State, who are incredibly knowledgeable experts on international boundaries, and their summaries are very useful, and it's a good, quick way of getting a feeling for the range of disputes around the world. And of course, there is also the excellent resource prepared by Professor Brunet Jailly, Border Disputes, a Global Encyclopedia, although I guess that's probably getting a little long in the tooth now. I can't remember exactly when it was published, but 15 or so years ago. That contains more in-depth studies of many of the world's more significant international boundary and border disputes. I'm framing the rest of this session around the concept of boundary making. It's a term that's been around for over 100 years now. It first appeared in a book by another British imperial boundary maker, Sir Thomas Holditch, who was a military surveyor who was tasked with marking boundaries on the ground in parts of the British Empire, and also involved in arbitrating disputed boundaries in South America. And I was quite excited when I first saw a book entitled Political Frontiers and Boundary Making. It turns out that he only used the term in the title of the book and never referred to it again. But nevertheless, this notion of creating international boundaries has been around for a long time. But the concept was really given life in a book published at the end of the Second World War, written by an American geographer called Stephen Jones. Jones was tasked by the American government with preparing a practical handbook for what I think the US government was expecting to be a major carve-up of territorial control following the Second World War, as there had been at the end of the First World War, when the victorious powers basically carved up the territories controlled by the defeated powers and drew a whole series of new international boundaries resulting from that big political process. And I think the expectation was that this would happen again after the Second World War. It didn't quite happen to the same extent, although there was some territorial realignment following the Second World War. And Jones wrote what I think is still the best practical guide to defining and maintaining international boundaries that is available anywhere. I should have updated this slide because the book is actually no longer available from W.S. Hine. You can find a copy of it on the website archive.org, which you can borrow it temporarily for free if you look for the title of the book there. Jones came up with a 4-stage process, which he described as a model of boundary making. He talked about the political allocation of territory. Remember, this was in the context of an international conflict, and the allocation was the broad political agreement that a certain piece of territory belongs to state A, and the adjoining territory would belong to state B, without too much concern about precisely where the line of division was. So allocation, typically post-conflict. This was then followed by delimitation, which I'll describe in a moment, physical demarcation on the ground, and then ongoing administration of the boundary that had been established through delimitation and demarcation. So I'm not going to talk much about allocation, but I'm going to talk about delimitation, demarcation, and develop the model about how these things relate to administration and border management, which Jones didn't really spend a lot of time dealing with. So let's look at delimitation. Delimitation is a legal term, and it relates to the agreed definition of the course of a boundary between two states. Usually this agreed definition is enshrined in a legally binding instrument such as a treaty. Clearly defining the limits of a state is an important element of statecraft, and so typically boundaries are defined through a formal international agreement between two states. And I would suggest the primary aim of delimitation is to provide a mutually acceptable and unambiguous definition of a boundary. Mutually acceptable because it's agreed between neighboring states, and unambiguous because you hopefully are creating a line that clearly defines the limits of each state. The problem we face is that many international boundaries were initially delimited when there was very limited geographical knowledge of the areas through which the boundary ran, meaning that an unambiguous definition was almost impossible to achieve because it was hard to describe the course of a boundary in an area about which little was known by the people drawing the line. And this is one of the consequences of European imperialism and colonialism, particularly in Africa and parts of South and East Asia. Lord Salisbury was a British Prime Minister who was speaking not long after what was infamously described as a scramble for Africa by European powers. And I think he was only half joking when he said, "We have been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no white man's foot ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew where the mountains and rivers and lakes were." There are many possible examples I can give of boundary definition in the absence of geographical knowledge of the areas through which the boundary ran. I'm just going to cite a handful. Firstly, showing that it's not just in areas that were subjected to European colonialism in the late 19th century, and not too far away from the University of Victoria, when Britain and Russia defined the boundary between Alaska and today's Yukon and British Columbia. The Panhandle, the section of that boundary which looks like a child got a little bit bored in tracing the 141st meridian, which forms much of the boundary between Alaska and Yukon. The line was simply described as the summit of the mountains situated parallel to the coast. It did provide a little more details, saying that if the summits of the mountains were more than 10 leagues from the ocean, then the boundary would follow a line parallel to the windings of the coast, never more than 10 leagues. But basically, this is a very vague understanding that there was a range of mountains not too far from the coastline of Western North America. And the idea was that the Russians, who had established a foothold along parts of that coastline, to maintain control over the coastal areas, whereas Britain would retain control over the interior of modern Canada beyond the coastal fringe. But given the vagueness of this description, parallel to the coast, summits of the mountains, which mountains? The highest mountains? It doesn't say. And it's hardly a surprise that it took nearly 80 years following this treaty to settle what this definition meant, and it was only settled in the end through an arbitration process. Another description, which on the face of it sounds a little better, is another one that has had major implications for the peoples in the Horn of Africa. The boundary between what is today Eritrea, at the time occupied by Italy, and Ethiopia was agreed in 3 treaties in the early 20th century. Most of the boundary was defined in an agreement in 1900, and the language of the treaty simply said the line Tomat, Todluk, which were 2 settlements, and then Marib, Belisa, Muna, that's 3 rivers, traced on the map annexed, is recognized as the boundary between Eritrea and Ethiopia. So we have 2 towns and 3 rivers defining more than 1,000 kilometers of international boundary. But at least there was a map, and the line defined on the map is recognized as the boundary between the 2 states. Unfortunately, this is the map that was annexed to the treaty. It looks like a child's drawing of an imaginary boundary between 2 countries. No scale bar, no lines of latitude or longitude to give reference to the location of places. A fair number of settlements marked, particularly on the Eritrean side of the boundary, but really little more than rivers sketched in. And it's a classic example of a map prepared by European explorers who knew very little about the landscape. They probably traveled along some rivers and had a vague sense of where they might be, but really no clear understanding of the landscape, the real landscape through which the boundary was running. And it's hardly surprising that nearly a century later, when Eritrea gained its independence from Ethiopia, it has a long and complex history, but it was occupied by Ethiopia following the Second World War, that there was a big disagreement between these 2 modern states as to how to interpret this poorly delimited boundary. And this was all that they had. I'll come back to it a little later to show the scope of the disagreement and some of the challenges that were associated with trying to figure out what this meant. And just a couple of examples of strange language from the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Part of the boundary between Cameroon and Nigeria was described as crossing a marsh until it reached a river passing quite close to a certain village, to a confluence of two unnamed rivers, about 2 kilometers to the northwest of the village. So really, even on a local scale, still not very much precision in terms of being able to fix where the boundary is actually located. Or another one from Southeast Asia, where the boundary between today's Myanmar and Thailand, the boundary crosses the valleys of two rivers in almost a straight line. I don't know quite how you draw almost a straight line, but that's how it's described. And then it meets the main watershed near the common source of two rivers. So again, local uncertainty, because the people defining the boundary didn't really understand the geography of the areas through which the boundary ran. And one dispute that I became quite involved in about 20 years ago, when the British government, which had become involved in the civil war in Sierra Leone, and the British Army had attempted to diffuse some of the conflict that had taken place within that country. The British government was keen to pull out of Sierra Leone and not maintain an ongoing occupying force. And one of the areas of contention concerned a border dispute in the remote northeast of Sierra Leone along the boundary with Guinea, where some Guinean soldiers had crossed over the Moa Makona River and were occupying a strip of territory on the south bank of that river, primarily because it was higher ground and gave them good views over the border area. But the occupation of that area had been challenged by Sierra Leone, who said, look, we have a treaty, we have a map, and the treaty says the boundary follows the left bank of the river based on the direction of flow. And look, you can see that boundary is clearly marked on a map. It's not a great map, but from in 1912, there was a survey of the river that had been established as the boundary. And markers had been put at certain points on the bank of the river. And Sierra Leone said quite clearly, we have a boundary on the bank of the river. Yes, all of the river belongs to Guinea. We don't have a problem with that. But you don't get to occupy up to 1 kilometer south of the boundary. But Guinea came up with some slightly spurious basis for a claim, saying that the concept of a river includes the concept of a once in 1,000-year flood. We're not just talking about the regular flow of the river, but where the river might extend to once every 1,000 years when there's major flooding. And it took 5 or 6 years from the emergence of this dispute to the two presidents sitting down and saying, okay, we need to settle this because it's impacting the lives of people who live on particularly the Sierra Leone side of this river. So even when there is reasonable mapping, reasonable technical language, the interpretation of where a boundary runs is often something that states struggle to disagree on. Sometimes the stimulus for the disagreement comes from a local action, in this case by a military commander who decided he wanted a good view over the border region. But nevertheless, the government of Guinea backed their soldiers, and it took a while for this problem to be resolved. I also used this example, and I guess the Eritrea-Ethiopia example is another one, because they're both river boundaries. And I'd like to reflect a little bit on river boundaries, because there are a lot of river boundaries around the world, and there's a lot of uncertainty relating to them. if we have over 255,000 kilometers of land boundary, nearly a third of that, 71,000 kilometers, is actually not dry land, but boundaries that follow rivers. 71,000 kilometers around the world. And the map on screen, it doesn't fully reflect that because it's only able to show major river boundaries. There's an awful lot of streams that you can't depict on a small scale world map. And for a significant number of countries, most or even all of their boundaries follow rivers. It's easy to understand why rivers were chosen. If we think back to that Eritrea-Ethiopia map, it was all that the two parties really had to go on at the time in terms of geographical understanding. But there was also a notion, I think, that rivers were somehow natural divisions of the geographical landscape. For some people, they were natural in the sense that they were almost ordained by nature. You see some of the very early writing about boundaries, talking a lot about natural boundaries, mountains, rivers as just obvious divisions between people. I don't agree with that. I don't think rivers are natural dividers of people. If anything, they bring people together, as people need access to water or use rivers for navigation. Rivers are, in a sense, more of a shared resource than a natural division. But nevertheless, as linear features of the natural landscape, rivers are often are somewhat obvious choices, I suppose I should say. If you're looking to find a line to divide a landscape that you don't greatly care about the people who live there, a river is in some ways an obvious choice. And it also potentially allows the two states on either side of the boundary to have access to an important resource in terms of the water. Rivers were sometimes seen as defensible lines as well. If the river was substantial enough from a military perspective, it was one way of slowing down any potential invasion from a neighboring state. It was sometimes argued that rivers didn't need any demarcation, no physical marking on the ground, because everybody could see where the river was. The river, once you get through the river, you see the water, and you know that you've reached a boundary. And that might have made sense to many European diplomats. This is a river I crossed just 2 days ago before I returned home to Canada from visiting family in the UK. The historical border between England and Scotland, the River Tweed, a very tranquil Western European river, which from time to time will flood over from its main channel, but it's fairly obvious what the river is. But for those of you from tropical parts of the world will know that not all rivers look like that. And indeed, these examples from Africa showed the wide range of physical characteristics of rivers, some of which dry out for much of the year, then flood way beyond the main river channel. And the example from the satellite image in the top of the image on screen now gives us a sense of just how much some rivers can move over time. Powerful water flow cutting through the often soft landscape, with the river channel shifting significantly, not just from decade to decade, but sometimes from year to year. Not necessarily a clearly identifiable linear feature of the landscape. This leads to many challenges in figuring out where an international boundary in a river is located. Sometimes states even disagree as to precisely which river was being referred to in a treaty. That's not uncommon in situations where colonial powers were using sketchy maps to describe the boundary, and the names of the rivers had been recorded by explorers who may not have understood what local people were telling them. There may have been the same name given to multiple streams in some parts of the world. So we do see examples of states which have disagreements over where their boundary runs because of multiple names, or the same name being used multiple times, making it difficult to know which actual river was being referred to. More commonly, there are disagreements over, firstly, where in the river the boundary is located. There are many treaties which simply describe the boundary as following the river rather than a specific line, whether it be the deepest channel, which is sometimes described as the Thalweg, or a line that is halfway between the two banks, if those banks can be easily defined, which is often a major challenge in itself. Many treaties have nothing to say about what happens if the river changes course over time, and the vast majority of rivers will shift laterally over time. Sometimes it takes tens of years for that shift to take place. Other times it can be a matter of months. And sometimes rivers can change suddenly, especially during major flooding events, when the force of the water cuts through a different channel from the one that was flowing previously. And there are legal debates as to whether or not the concept of avulsion, the sudden change of a river channel, changes the course of a river boundary or not. There have been significant disputes over who owns islands in rivers, and islands are not always permanent. Sometimes they emerge, disappear, join together, and very rarely do we see any kind of formal agreement as to what happens when these physical changes take place. An example from North America, the international boundary between Canada and the United States was defined in the middle of the 19th century, and where the boundary followed rivers, the treaty said that the boundary followed the middle of the river, but also said that the boundary would be fixed along the channel of the river as it existed in 1842. Many of the stream sections of that boundary have changed significantly, and the images on screen show firstly a section of Hall's streams in northeast Canada, USA. In 1923, the black, you can see the black line more or less is still located in the channel of the river, although in the if I can do this. In the north here, you can see that the river has shifted to the east, leaving what is known as an oxbow lake. And so even though the main river channel in 1923 was here, the boundary continued to follow the course of the boundaries it had been in the middle of the 19th century. And then if we look at more modern mapping of the same area, you can see the river shifting even further to the east here, then running across the international boundary, back across the international boundary, back again. And what it creates is pockets of territory of one state located effectively on the wrong side of the river. So in this image here, this is the territory of Canada, and because the international boundary is located to the east of the river, this is still Canada here, but because it's not easy to get across the river, the land here has effectively become dead and may well, in fact, be used by people on the USA side, creating a tension between local practice and legal reality. And looking at a slightly different section to the northeast. So the river today is running along the line I'm highlighting now. A relic Oxbow Lake of the old channel is here. So this is no longer part of the river, but the boundary continues to follow the original course of the river as it was in 1842. And we can see very clearly here that this field, which is part of the USA, is being used by a Canadian farmer, because on the US side, it's not easy to get to the field. You'd have to probably drive several kilometers to a border crossing into Canada, around, and then gain access through a field on the Canadian side. So even between friendly states, river boundaries are challenging. Let's skip forward a little bit here now. There are challenges relating to the definition of river boundaries, and many challenges relating to how shared rivers are used, both for navigational purposes and for non-navigational purposes, be it fishing, accessing minerals in the rivers, for irrigation of farmland, possibly the generation of hydroelectric power and other industrial purposes. Rivers are important, not just because they form international boundaries, but because they need to be shared. And we've seen several examples of states with significant disagreements over the use of river boundaries, as well as states struggling to define precisely where their boundaries follow rivers. Jones, in his boundary making book, was very skeptical about river boundaries, and he rather snootily said it's perhaps unnecessary to point out that the problems of marking, maintenance, and administration sum up to a warning that river boundaries should be avoided wherever possible. That's all well and good if you're starting from scratch, but of course, the vast majority of international boundaries predate 1945, and you can't simply avoid them. You have to figure out what to do with them. It's an issue that I wrote about in a handbook that was prepared for the African Union as part of the African Union Border Programme. This handbook and several others relating to defining and managing boundaries in Africa are available for download from the African Union website. Unfortunately, there's not a single page from which you can download them all, but if you search for the titles of these handbooks, you should be able to locate them and download them for free. They're written with Africa in mind, but many of the topics that are discussed are equally applicable to international boundary definition and management in other parts of the world. And they're a very useful resource that I would recommend if you're interested in practical issues relating to creating and managing international boundaries. How are we doing for time? I think now would be a good point. I understand that it's good to take a short break in the presentation. Is that right, Leah?
Yeah, we can do that. There was one question in the chat.
Okay.
If we want to do that before we take a break. Yatahun, do you want to pose your question, or do you want me to read it out for you?
Please read it.
Okay. Getahun asked, Ethiopia-Eritrea border dispute cost thousands of lives in the recent two wars. Has got international arbitration still volatile? What do you suggest for the future?
Okay, I was going to come to it in the context of demarcation, but I'll put this slide up now. So I mentioned the scope of disagreement between the two states, trying to interpret the old colonial boundaries from treaties from the early 20th century. There were significant differences between the two states as to how to interpret those agreements. And unfortunately, after an incident which involved somebody being shot at a meeting between the two boundary commissions trying to figure out where the boundary ran. That disagreement quickly escalated into very serious conflict, as you suggested, which resulted in at least 60,000 soldiers being killed. And there was a long and difficult process following that conflict, trying to define the boundaries through the work of a boundary commission, which was effectively an arbitral tribunal in the first instance, which eventually came up with a ruling on the course of the boundary, which was its best interpretation of those three colonial agreements. The problem was that Ethiopia felt that as a result of that arbitration, it was its claims had not been properly interpreted by the Boundary Commission. The Commission didn't really help explain some of its decisions in a way that many ordinary people could understand, and Ethiopia struggled to accept the award, and so there was a lot of tension along that boundary for several years, even after a formally binding arbitral award was made. And subsequently, largely through political pressure, Ethiopia has been persuaded to accept the boundary in principle, but there are still significant tensions. It's not uncommon, even when two states have agreed to go through a binding dispute resolution process relating to territory, to figure out what to do once the legal and technical process has been completed. They essentially have a line imposed, and then the arbitrators go back to their day jobs as lawyers working all around the world, and leave the two governments to figure out how to manage the issue post-conflict. And in a sense, this is part of what I'm trying to get through in this session, is the process of boundary making is not just about defining the line. And unfortunately, a lot of countries have to pick up the pieces, and it's not always easy to figure out a good regime that will endure even when the boundary has, in theory, been settled. So delimitation, the legal definition of a boundary, typically in a treaty, historically a description of the line. Today, more commonly, delimitation involves defining a boundary with a series of geographical coordinates. But demarcation, which is the second stage of Jones's boundary making model, is going from the definition of the boundary to a physical marking of the boundary on the ground. And I would suggest that there are two reasons for demarcating an international boundary. And the first of those relates to the fact that many initial delimitations were quite vague, sometimes ambiguous, and demarcation improves the quality of the initial delimitation. Many of the early delimitation agreements of international boundaries actually acknowledged the fact that they didn't know everything about the landscape through which the boundary ran, and anticipated that the delimitation would be improved by sending out surveyors who would map and mark the boundary on the ground, reflecting the realities that they found. So I'm not going to go through all of these examples here, but basically there were cases where there was a recognition that there might be a particular tribe or group of people who should be on one side of the boundary or the other, and it was unclear precisely where the territory of the local people extended. And the demarcators were asked to define the boundary on the ground in such a way that there was not a division between that particular tribal group. I have to say it's relatively rare to take people into consideration in this way, particularly in Africa, but it did happen occasionally. The one example I really like is the third of these quotations, coming from the boundary between today's Zambia and Democratic Republic of Congo, where in principle the boundary followed the watershed, the line separating two river systems, the Congo and the Zambezi rivers. But the boundary commission that was established as part of the delimitation agreement was given the authority to make minor rectifications and adjustments of the ideal watershed as are necessary to avoid the troubles which might arise from a literal interpretation of the treaty. So the demarcation process was designed to refine a theoretical division based on a division of two rivers, and it would be taking into account things like access to wells, local grazing rights, or local grazing patterns, perhaps, rather than rights, based on realities on the ground. So boundary demarcation was really part of the process of delimitation. And typically, many of these early demarcation commissions actually only put pillars up in a few important locations along a boundary. Their main purpose was mapping and clarifying the delimitation. And in terms of Jones's boundary making model, what I'd like to suggest is that his four-step process is a little bit of a simplification. There may be a political allocation of territory. As I say, it generally only occurs post-conflict. But instead of just one delimitation and one demarcation, what we actually have is an initial delimitation, clarified by survey work with some physical marking on the ground. And that survey work, the mapping, erecting of pillars, would probably result in a report describing where the pillars are located and where the boundary has departed from the initial description to accommodate local situations. So the demarcation improves the delimitation. Subsequently, there may be need for further demarcation on the ground, because the initial demarcation was relatively scant and maybe resources were limited, or the time frame for sending people into the field was not enough to cover the whole boundary. So at some point in the future, there'd be further survey work, further marking on the ground, again, improving the delimitation. So it's more like a chain of legal definition and physical, bringing the boundary to life on the ground through the physical mapping and marking of where the boundary is actually located. In theory, this process could go on indefinitely, but hopefully at some point, both countries will say, we have defined the boundary both legally, technically, and on the ground with sufficient clarity for practical needs. I can't say in any particular case at what stage that would take place, because a lot will depend on the physical and human geography of the border landscape. And I'll come on to that in a second. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that delimitation and demarcation are interrelated and they're not single steps. And I get rather frustrated when I hear diplomats talking about the fact that boundary X has been delimited and demarcated. There's nothing left to do. The reality is often that, yes, there is some demarcation on the ground, but there's still a lot of uncertainty in reality. And the question is, can the neighboring states live with that uncertainty, or is there a need for further refinement of where the boundary is located? The second element of demarcation is to make the boundary sufficiently visible to meet the practical needs of the two states. And as I say, that can vary from boundary to boundary, and indeed along the course of a boundary. because what the practical needs of the states are likely to reflect how many people live near the boundary, how many people cross the boundary, who is affected by this line that is established running through a landscape between two states. There are different ways of making a boundary visible. Classically, it's the erection of some kind of pillar or other monument at a particular point, which is intervisible from the next point along the boundary in either direction. So wherever you are on the boundary, you can see at least two pillars, and at any one marker, you should be able to see the next pillar in each direction. But that doesn't always happen, and there are other ways of making a boundary visible. One of the examples here was literally the line being painted on the ground when Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon in 2000. Unfortunately, this boundary still remains provisional, and with the prospect of further conflict between Israel and forces in Lebanon, who knows quite where the international boundary between those two states will eventually end up. But nevertheless, there was a process in which the United Nations helped to clarify on the ground as well as on maps where a historical boundary had been established. And sometimes it's not just putting up markers, but actually clearing vegetation. Between Canada and the United States, there is a legal requirement for the Boundary Commission to maintain a boundary vista. I think it's a width of, I want to say 30 feet, 15 feet on either side of the precise legal boundary that has to be cleared. And with over 8,000 kilometers of international boundary between those two countries, it's a challenge even for two well-resourced governments to maintain a clear line of visibility along the international boundary. But they attempt to do so by hiring crews who operate throughout the summer months in different sections of the boundary, even in extremely remote locations, to maintain the visibility of the line, which is considered important under the treaty regime of an international boundary. In some ways, demarcation has not changed enormously since the early period of boundary making in the early 20th century. In other ways, it has changed enormously. These photos from the Canada-USA boundary and demarcation in 1910. One thing that has changed significantly is our ability to map remote regions with precision. The photograph on the left shows someone undertaking what was called a plane table survey, which literally involved sketching in the landscape that a surveyor could see from a particular high point. There would be a process of what was known as triangulation between tripoints to help fix coordinates. But identifying a point on the ground with geographical precision in terms of coordinates was very challenging, even for experienced surveyors working in remote locations, until the advent of satellite positioning towards the end of the 20th century, which has transformed the ability to erect pillars with great precision in terms of geographical coordinates. So in one sense, these are images from the post-conflict demarcation of the boundary between Iraq and Kuwait in the 1990s. In one sense, not much has changed, more machinery involved, but still locating points on the ground using survey techniques. In another sense, having satellite positioning has allowed for very precise location of the coordinates of a boundary, and even changed to what, in the case of Eritrea, Ethiopia, was called very disparaging by Ethiopia, the virtual demarcation of the boundary. We looked at this map just before the break. The Boundary Commission was supposed to physically demarcate the boundary. Because of the lack of cooperation from Ethiopia and also the presence of thousands of landmines in the along the border from the conflict in the late 1990s. It was very difficult to send surveyors out into the field. And what happened in the end was that the Boundary Commission, with help from the international community, produced a series of beautiful large-scale maps, and using these maps identified the location of the points where it would erect boundary pillars if it could get onto the ground. It was unable to do so, and eventually, in frustration, the Commission said, if the two parties can't agree on anything different within 12 months, this will be the demarcated boundary and we will have completed our work. And this is where Ethiopia became very frustrated and said, this is not demarcation. This is delimitation. It's a virtual demarcation at best. Until we put pillars in the ground, this boundary does not become real for local people. People living in the borderland areas, such as between Eritrea and Ethiopia, are going to have zero idea of where this boundary is running based on these maps. No matter how good the maps are from a technical perspective, the people are not going to have access to them. And even if they did, interpreting maps is not a skill that everybody has without training. And there is a danger that describing this kind of process of producing a map with a point where a pillar should be, if you describe that as demarcation, I think it's misleading and not helpful in terms of the context of settling disagreements between people who live in border areas, because they won't understand where the boundary is. This is not, in my view, a real demarcation, and the language should be used more carefully to describe what happened here, which was, while I can understand the frustrations of the Boundary Commission, what it ended up with was a precise delimitation and not a real demarcation. It matters in terms of making boundaries visible to local people. I think it's important to ask the right questions. As I said, diplomats and lawyers often have a rather binary view of this. They say, is the boundary delimited and demarcated? Yes or no? I think that's a poor question. My question would be, what needs to be done to ensure that the boundary is unambiguously delimited and appropriately demarcated? Unambiguously delimited can be somewhat objectively measured today, given our ability to view landscapes from the air with satellite imagery, aerial photography, and good quality topographic mapping. Appropriately demarcated depends on many factors and can vary significantly along the length of a boundary. In sparsely inhabited areas, there may be not enormous need for pillars being erected every 500 meters or so. In more densely populated areas, it's more important for local people to know where the boundary is located. So what is appropriate between two states can vary significantly along the length of a boundary. An additional element of the boundary making model is what I would call recovery or reaffirmation. This is again linked to the fact that many international boundaries were first established 100 or more years ago, often not maintained significantly through the colonial period, and following independence of states from colonial rule, keeping boundaries visible on the ground was rarely the highest priority for governments. Building schools, educating their populations, dealing with other conflicts often took precedence, and the boundaries often disappeared from the landscape. So recovery involves trying to interpret as best as possible where a boundary was established and then clarifying it through possibly a new treaty and physical demarcation on the ground today. It's something that is very significant in Africa. And what I've described as recovery is often called reaffirmation. states taking ownership of their boundaries, inherited from colonial powers, not always with great enthusiasm at the time of independence, but agreement that it was better to keep the boundaries that they inherited rather than to try and figure out new boundaries. But keeping those boundaries involves taking ownership of them, trying to figure out precisely where they ran. This can involve fieldwork, sometimes very demanding fieldwork. These are photographs from the Cameroon-Nigeria boundary, which involved trekking over 800 kilometers, looking for little stone markers that had been established at some point during the pre-independence period, often by local leaders who understood where of the two states ended, but with no support from central powers, were left simply to mark the limits of their territory as best they could. Fascinating experience I had working with the Palestinian Authority, trying to understand where the armistice lines that were agreed following the conflict between Israel and its neighbors in 1948, where those armistice lines actually ran on the ground, and during the period between 1949 and 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And the 1967 line is intended by the Palestinians to be the basis for negotiating future boundaries. But the government of Israel had gone to quite considerable lengths to eliminate those armistice lines from the ground after occupation. And it was quite a major task to try and figure out where the armistice lines were as of 1967. And one thing we discovered was that people who had lived through that period, the armistice period for 20 years, had amazing recollection of where the lines of separation on the ground existed during that period. We found a few physical remnants of that line, but the gentleman on the left was in his 80s, and he had been recommended to us as someone who had lived in Jerusalem. At the time, it was a divided city, and we took him up to a hilltop and asked him if he could remember where the fencing had run through the city at that time. And it was like the years just dropped away from him, and he was a teenager again. He could remember exactly where the line of separation between East and West Jerusalem were located, and his description to us of where those lines were was absolutely invaluable in understanding the landscape, and it brought home to me the importance of the human element of living in border areas in terms of understanding not just the current experience, but historical experience of division as well. The process of reaffirmation is ongoing in much of Africa. More and more states are clarifying precisely where their boundaries are located. And it is a source of some pride that new pillars are being erected through cooperation and constructive negotiation to bring these boundaries to life for local people and clarify precisely the limits of the states, which are now fully independent and understanding the limits of their own territory. But it's not just about building pillars. They often disappear from the landscape for a variety of reasons. These look rather like crime scenes, and to some extent they are. It's not human crime, it's a perfectly understandable treatment of boundary pillars. These come from the boundary between Malaysia and Thailand, and it's the consequences of elephants enjoying using boundary markers as scratching posts. But unfortunately, the elephants tend to get a bit enthusiastic, and the pillars often suffer as a consequence. And there are many reasons why boundary markers are damaged. Sometimes it's natural in the form of animals or occasionally storms. Sometimes it's human agency, people wanting to use metals that are often in the center of concrete pillars to sell or to use the pillars themselves for building. Along the Canada-USA boundary, close to where I live, boundary markers are sometimes used as target practice by young people with not very much to do in remote border areas. Maintenance is important. And sometimes it's almost a symbolic thing. This is an example of maintenance on the Canada-USA boundary. An awful lot of time and effort goes into establishing these pillars, and they have an important symbolic role. And so why not take the care to ensure that they are visible and cared for and rebuilt and painted as necessary? Maintenance is an ongoing task, and it is not simply something that happens after the boundary has been first established. Once it is marked on the ground in some way, there is likely to be need for ongoing maintenance. And as the definition of the boundary improves, the task of maintenance becomes bigger. But it's an important element in making a boundary, keeping a boundary visible, and also ensuring that two states take pride in the lines that they have established, whether or not they're meant to be lines of division, or as some people often describe boundaries as bridges more than barriers. But sometimes boundaries are barriers, and one way of making a boundary visible, very visible, is by sealing the boundary. Typically, boundary fences are not located precisely on the boundary. Usually they're established by one of the two neighboring states and therefore located entirely within the territory of the state that builds it to protect that state's territory. In a sense, it involves giving up a little strip of territory, because in practice, nobody from state A can access the territory of state A on the other side of the fence. But for state A, it is often a small price to pay in relation to the security that the fence typically provides. The example on the right from Malaysia, Thailand is the only example I can think of where the two states jointly constructed a fence precisely along the line of the international boundary. So it does happen occasionally. More commonly, these kind of barriers are slightly inside one of the states, thereby de facto creating a border zone. In other words, a disjunction between the legal boundary and the physical infrastructure of preventing access across the boundary from one state to another. Wherever they are located, fences have functional consequences, which brings us into the realm of the final and arguably the most important element of boundary making, which is border management. It's taken me a while to get here, but it is what neighboring states do with their boundary once it has been established that determines whether it is a success or not. Delimitation, demarcation, maintenance, recovery, all important processes in establishing an international boundary. But it is the management of that boundary that ultimately determines whether it is something positive for two neighboring states or something negative. And management is required throughout the process of boundary making. From the first delimitation, where there is a line described, whether or not it is clear or not, states have to manage a variety of relations across that line. Stephen Jones didn't really address management. That's not necessarily a critique of his work. He was asked to produce a handbook for establishing international boundaries. but his books essentially stopped at the maintenance element of it. Border management is a bigger, broader, more challenging task. And I'd like to spend the last little part of this session looking at border management, and in particular, management in areas where boundaries still remain uncertain or even disputed. An American historian, Oscar Martinez, who wrote primarily about the boundary between Mexico and the United States, came up with what I think is a very useful model linking international boundaries and borders and how they affect the borderlands which surround them. Borderlands I would define as the areas on either side of an international boundary that are affected by the presence of that boundary. The width of the borderland is largely determined by the management strategies that the neighboring states deploy, whether it's unilaterally or bilaterally. If you have a physical barrier that prevents any kind of movement across a border, it is likely to result in what Martinez called an alienated borderland, in which there's very little contact between people on either side of the barrier. The borderland there's a boundary, but no true borderland, no cross-border relations of any kind. The greater the degree of movement and exchange across an international boundary would lead to the development of coexistent borderlands, interdependent borderlands, and finally, integrated borderlands. The more movement and exchange you have, the greater the breadth of the borderland. And in Martinez's argument, the greater the health of the borderland. It's not necessarily the case that all states start off with alienated borderlands and aim to have integrated borderlands. For many states, coexistence or interdependence is probably the best they can hope for, given the political, economic, strategic relationships between the states. So it's not a sequential model, it's 4 different stages, and states can move back and forth over time depending on how their relationships develop. The key point I want to make is the nature of the borderland is going to be affected by the border management policies that are developed and implemented by the states. And those border management policies need to take into account a variety of elements. Access and security, the classical 2 sides of international boundary management, but also issues such as transboundary infrastructure, the management of transboundary resources and environmental issues, and the degree to which the borderland needs to develop economically and culturally. Traditionally, borders were about, first and foremost, maintaining security. But most states, most of the time, agree that borders should be as open as possible, as well as secure as possible. And it's an almost impossible balancing act. The more open the border is, the more difficult it is to secure. But finding that balance is going to depend very much on whether the 2 states are sympathetic to each other in terms of their views about movement of people, trade, and ideas across the boundary, and the degree to which they have common perceptions of the importance of security. If one state favors security while the other state favors access, it's going to be very difficult to find an effective border management regime that allows for a healthy borderland. When we think about things as relating to infrastructure, that could be roads, railways, telecommunications, power, and even sewerage. The cartoon on the bottom right here reflects a An agreement that was finally reached on Cyprus after that island was divided in the 1970s. And not many people think about it, but sometimes managing waste and water can be a challenge which affects people's lives quite significantly on a day-to-day basis. And 3 years of negotiations finally led to an agreement in an area which had been torn apart, where previously they had the people on the north and south of Cyprus had shared sewerage infrastructure and waste disposal, and not having that was made life even more unpleasant on a day-to-day basis than many people would have imagined before that island was divided following occupation of the northern part of the island. Sorry, I'm moving a little fastly, but I realize time is getting away from me. Okay, nearly done. Just to note that factors that potentially affect the management strategies that states adopt are likely to be determined by a range of factors, both the physical and human geography of the border landscapes. Who lives where? How much of the physical landscape is divided by a boundary? Are there natural ecosystems that the boundary divides? Or are there obvious areas where it is better for one state or the other to administer things like drainage basins? The political priorities of the two states and the relationship of the two governments across the boundary are clearly going to have an impact on the extent to which cooperation is possible. To what extent do two states share similar administrative structures which can be harmonized in terms of managing access, resources, environment, and infrastructure? And when I say resources, I'm thinking of managing natural resources, but there's also financial resources that will dictate the degree to which effective cooperation can be achieved. Do both states act? Are they able to implement the measures that are considered desirable to ensure good cross-border relations? And then finally, and I've asked this question, to what extent does the status of the boundary affect border management strategies? If the boundary is uncertain, precise alignment of the boundary is uncertain, how much does that affect the ability of two states to cooperate over managing the border area? And when Emmanuel and I first threw ideas around about what we might discuss in this session, I suggested border management along uncertain boundaries as a possible topic, because it's an area that I think is largely under-researched, and I don't necessarily have a lot of answers on it. But my initial assumption was that border management will be more difficult when neighboring governments aren't clear about precisely where their boundary is located. Having reflected on the topic, I'm no longer certain that that is always the case. There are some issues where I think uncertain boundaries do create problems for neighboring governments. And one risk where you have a boundary alignment which is uncertain is the risk of encroachment by the people who live on one side of the boundary across the boundary, because they don't know precisely where the international boundary runs. And it's natural human behavior to take advantage of farmland or to be able to build in a particular area if the boundary is not clearly understood. And so there are many cases around the world of settlement or farmland which has encroached across the international boundary, more by accident than design. And this can sometimes lead to difficulties if the two governments don't handle it well. And one example I have of very poor border management comes from the large transboundary settlements of Goma and Gisheni, along the boundary between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, where for many years the international boundary was not maintained, probably not clearly understood by the two countries. But with the emergence of the African Union encouraging member states of the African Union to clarify their boundaries, the Joint Boundary Commission decided that any settlement that was located within, I think it was 15 meters of the boundary that they determined through a negotiation process, any settlement in that zone of the boundary was simply going to be demolished in order to keep the boundary visible on the ground. And that was considered more important than the fact that people were just trying to live their regular lives and had no real idea that they had been building on an area through which an international boundary was running. And unfortunately, this led to the demolition of something like 500 homes located in this so-called border corridor that the two states tried to reimpose. So encroachment is an issue for some states and not always met with sensitivity by the two governments on either side of the line. Some states seek to establish buffer zones in order to prevent encroachment along the international boundary. The problem with buffer zones is that they often give the impression that there is some kind of no man's land in which neither state has any jurisdiction. And that uncertainty can mean that a buffer zone can start to become a lawless zone, or is viewed as an area in which people can, if they're brave, occupy the territory and escape the jurisdiction of the authorities on either side of this zone of uncertainty. And so the concept of a buffer zone along a boundary needs to be handled with caution, I would suggest, even as a temporary solution in the presence of uncertain boundaries. But what I've actually discovered in looking into this is that states often establish formal border management structures, even in the absence of clearly defined boundaries. I've done quite a lot of work in Thailand, and I discovered that along its uncertain boundaries with both Cambodia and Myanmar, there are border crossings in operation. Cambodia would say that the border crossing here is incorrectly located, but nevertheless both sides have border crossing infrastructure and people move relatively freely across that boundary on a daily basis, even though there is a formal dispute between the two states as to where the land boundary reaches the sea. And another reality that I've observed in many parts of the world is that people tend to do their own thing anyway. Informal border crossings are created. On the right, the Myanmar-Thailand photograph here is one I took of people crossing a completely informal crossing about 200 yards from the formal border crossing that was pictured on the previous slide. And even more dramatically, I think, the example of an international border crossing between the Dominican Republic and Haiti on a bridge, or local people simply walking across the river, completely ignored by the border officials standing just a few feet above them. Borders are curious things. I highlighted Oscar Martinez's notion of alienated borderlands. And people find ways of overcoming barriers. Some examples, some humorous perhaps, but cross-border volleyball games taking place along the Mexico-USA border, or people being human cannonballs being fired across a border fence, or people simply scaling border fences. The famous poem by Robert Frost, which gave rise to which included the line that good fences make good neighbors, is often quoted before states erect border fences. But that line comes from a poem where, if you read it carefully, the line "good fences make good neighbors" comes from the narrow-minded neighbor of the narrator of the poem. And the opening line of the poem is, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down." And I think Frost's poem was very much against the idea of building fences between neighbors, and whether it's on a local scale or an international scale. The reality is that most people don't respond well to barriers, and will find some way to get around it, whether it's physically or even symbolically, with these examples of graffiti from the Israeli security barrier separating Israel from much of the West Bank. In conclusion, I just want to highlight the importance of good geographic information in understanding international boundaries and in the process of boundary making and border management. Good boundaries require an understanding of and a sensitivity to both the physical and human landscapes of the border areas. The policies that states develop should reflect the realities of the border landscape. Yes, these are artificial lines, but they run through real physical and human landscapes. And the more sensitive you are to those landscapes, the more appropriate both the definitional side of boundary making and the management of the borderlands on either side of the boundary will be. The delimitation and demarcation side of things require technical skills relating to positioning and mapping, which are typically the realm of surveyors and other geographers who study the shape of the earth and understand how to map and locate positions with precision. In the realm of border management or boundary management, the organization and hopefully the exchange across the border of a wide range of spatial data in order to develop effective management strategies. And if disputes arise, it's likely that effective dispute resolution is going to involve careful analysis and interpretation of a wide range of complex geographical information. As someone who spends a lot of time mapping, I keep this cartoon on the wall of my office, reminding me of the importance of careful geographical study and trying to get a sense of how to not only depict, but to really understand the landscape of an international boundary, the importance of both precision and careful communication of international boundaries through mapping can be an important part of not necessarily resolving boundary disputes, but hopefully preventing them in the first place.